today is the second in our four-part installment, The Sign of the Times. Today, the Seattle Times, brilliant planning, are here with the well-known sports reporters. And Mike Shepard, Senior VP of Business Operations, our member, will introduce the panel. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you, President Laura. We're 3/4 of the way through the NFL season, and our Seattle, you guys can sit, it's fine. We're 3/4 of the way through the NFL season, and our Seattle Seahawks have the best record in the league. They haven't lost at home in I don't know how long. They're coming off a Monday night trouncing of the team with the second best record in the conference. All of that means that the national media is just starting to figure out that there's actually a pretty good football team west of Denver and north of San Francisco that's led by a twice-fired coach and an undersized second-year quarterback who was a draft afterthought. This is not news to our trio of speakers today. Jerry Brewer, Bob Condotta, and Danny O'Neill have been eyewitnesses to what is looking to be the most successful season in the franchise's history, and they're eager to share with you some of their observations about where this team came from, where it's going, and what it's like to be a professional journalist covering the Seahawk and NFL beats. If you're a sports fan, you hear all three of our panelists on the radio, but each of them has deep roots with the Seattle Times. Our moderator today, Jerry Brewer, in the middle, is one of our sports columnists. Before joining the Times in 2006, he worked at three other newspapers, the Louisville Courier-Journal in Kentucky, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Orlando Sentinel. He covered the National Football League, the NBA, and was a columnist all within the first 4 years of his career. His stories have received awards from the Associated Press Sports Editors, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the National Sportscasters and Sports Writers Association. He holds a bachelor's degree from Western Kentucky University, and his mantra is, "The game isn't the story. The game is a platform to tell a story." To my immediate right here is Danny O'Neill. He's originally from Oregon. He's the son of a logger. He attended high school in Northern California and graduated from college at the University of Washington with a degree in history. He's worked for the Times on 3 different occasions, most recently covering the Seahawks from 2006 up until this spring. And he's currently a co-host, a radio host at 710 ESPN Seattle on the Brock and Danny show that airs from 9 to noon, and he skidded right into here from that show this morning, and continues also to cover the Seahawks beat on a daily basis online as well as the radio. And then to my far right is Bob Condotta. He knows our state as well as any sports writer around from my perspective. He grew up in Richland, went to high school in Issaquah, and college at Washington State University, where he was my boss for a little while. So naturally, of course, he spent 17 years covering the sports at the University of Washington. First for the Tacoma News-Tribune, and for the past 11 years for the Times. He took over the Seahawks beat when Danny turned in his notepad for a microphone. I'll tell you, Bob's productivity is legendary among his colleagues, and you can see proof of that both on the Times' pages and on the Seahawks blog. Before I turn it over to them, I want to note that we had some really terrific photography from 3 of the Times' great photographers, Dean Rutz, Bettina Hansen, and John Locke, for you to enjoy as well. We have a good amount of time today, so you're going to hear from these 3, and then we should have good time for questions as well. Thank you. Take it away.
Well, thank you all for being here. I had a fear that we'd come here and there'd be like 12 people, and Danny and I would start fighting because we have dueling radio shows, actually. My show airs during the last 2 hours of his show, so on the drive here, I actually got to hear Danny at the end of his show for the first time. It was pretty funny. He was talking about his love of the rap group, the Wu-Tang Clan.
This is my first boss was on the air, and they booked him without my knowledge. So my first boss when I worked at ESPN was on the air explaining all the stories about when I was 22 years old and living in Connecticut and working there.
That's the funny thing, though. You are a rap historian. You know more about it than I do. You have some African American in your blood for sure. Bob Condotta, I call Bob the green hoodie because if this were a normal day, you'd see Bob wearing his green hoodie, which is I mean, it's very versatile because the Seahawks practice facility, even their indoor practice bubble, is very, very cold. But Bob is a very relaxed guy, a fantastic journalist, and we're quite honestly, I mean, we are all good friends. If we at this time on a normal day, we would be waiting for Pete Carroll to do his press conference and giving each other a hard time about, my use of AOL still.
The fact that Bob looks like Bobby Brasco, like if we were gonna critique the attire today, and the fact that I still can't dress.
Yeah, he can't dress and he wears suits every day. But anyway, we have a hot story here, and it's interesting because the three of us come from very different perspectives on how we cover the team, and we'll just kind of start there, and we'll start with you, Danny. You used to be in Bob Condotta's role as a beat writer. Now, even though you still cover the team every day, you're in more of an opinionist role on the radio. How do you go about covering this phenomenon of this Seahawks season?
Well, I think the first thing is that there's a couple different things that happen. I've covered the Seahawks now on a daily basis for 8 years, and one of the things that I've covered them when they went to the Super Bowl for the first time. I've also covered them when they struggled, and how exciting it is when you have a successful team. And the reason is because the reason everybody's here right now, we all gather together and we kind of celebrate around. Sports is one of the few things, I think, in our society currently that brings communities together, where you unite across all sorts of different, you end up having the high-fiving strangers moment at a sporting game, unlike you do in any other thing, like that where you'll lose track. It doesn't matter if you know that person's name even. There's a shared sort of enthusiasm, and this team right now, I would say, has resonated with the community in a way that I've never seen a team do that. And it's not like I've been around here forever, but I have. I've went to college here from 93 to 97. I've lived back in Seattle since 99. And even in 2005, when they were really good, it did not resonate with the community in this way. The closest thing I can remember is 2001, when the Mariners won 116 games. And there is a shared enthusiasm that comes from that. I just feel really fortunate to be in a position to first cover the team at the Seattle Times and interact with people that way. And now in my role where I talk about it, it's a really, really fun position to be in. We talk about it as a journey all the time, but there really is. We're never going to get a chance to experience this thing again, where you have Russell Wilson really for the first time with a Super Bowl contender, and we're getting to see this team come together and a coach that was twice fired, as Mike mentioned, and they have as good a shot, maybe a better shot than anyone else at winning it all this year. It's a blast. I'm having a really good time.
Hey, Bob, this is your first year on the beat after covering the Huskies for, 17 years?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And you've seen one loss, We used to, I think the Seahawks found ways to lose like 3 times in a week before. So some of those days that Danny and I covered, especially in the Jim Mora era. Just what has the first year been like for you?
Yeah, it's been. I covered University of Washington football since 1997 was my primary thing, and they were really good too when I first got on there. And then, as a lot of you know, they were not very good for quite a while there, and now they're kind of getting on the right track, and now they got to go find a coach. I kind of stumbled into covering the Seahawks when Danny left. They just kind of called me and said, Danny left, and do you want to do it? And sure, so I'll do it. So, and didn't even really think about at the time how good the Seahawks might be, and might end up covering another Super Bowl and all of that. So it has been really crazy. For myself, there's a lot of differences between college and the NFL, and sort of the atmosphere around the teams and the programs, and you walk into the locker room every day, and every day you're going to see some guys that might not be there the next week, and that's a little different in college, where it's kind of like guys sign on, and for the most part they're going to be there for 4 or 5 years, and you sort of watch them grow from 18 to 22. In the NFL, you see this constant. They're putting together the best team they can each day, a different set of 46 players on every Sunday to go win a game, and guys are literally playing for their jobs all the time. So it's a little bit different from that standpoint, just trying to understand the dynamics of the NFL.
I'm not going to let Bob do that. He's going to explain this. Oh, they just came to me and said, no, there's a voracious appetite for this team. And do we have a reporter that can do the work of 3 people?
I know,
and fortunately enough, the Seattle Times does have a reporter that can do the work of 3 people, and it's Bob. Bob's fantastic. Anybody who followed his coverage of the Husky football team and what he was able to do there in terms of the depth of knowledge he has about that, I think it's a really fantastic opportunity. And what you've done with the blog and the way you cover it is as detailed and as labor-intensive as anything I've ever seen.
The check obviously cashed earlier this morning.
Well, I mean, Danny doesn't want us to hate on him for leaving us in the middle of this year, so he's very complimentary whenever he can be.
As Mike said, Danny's been a 3-time employee of the Times now. I think he holds a record. So, and
he's already going for number 4.
There's still time. I've learned you got to keep all doors open. When you don't have talent, you can't burn any bridges.
You're like the Billy Martin of the Seattle Times. You'll just keep coming back.
The funny thing is we used to have a HR resources person, and her name was Marge Ceccarelli, and Marge was phenomenal. And the first time I went through, I was a senior in college, and I worked there part-time. And the second time I went through, she looked at me, and they had this old mainframe computer system. She's like, I remember you being slow the first time, too.
All right, well, we're going to fly through this because we want to have plenty of time for questions because there's an array of stuff. We all know what happened with Washington football and Steve Sarkisian leaving to go to USC, so we'd love to take some questions about that. Mariners supposedly, allegedly, in pursuit of the number 1 free agent, Robinson Cano, who would cost them $200 million. So there's a lot of things going on in Seattle sports this week. I don't know why they had to pick this week when the Seahawks had like the biggest game ever, but that's kind of the way it goes. When it rains, it pours. But the fascinating thing about the Seahawks is the meteoric rise, and they are a team of enormous extremes. They have the larger-than-life personality that is Richard Sherman. They have Pete Carroll, this coach who has this awkward charisma because he talks a million miles a minute. He thinks he's very funny when sometimes you don't understand what he says. He doesn't complete sentences ever, yet and still there's this aura that he has about him. We're talking the most physical team in the NFL, bar none. You got the drug issue that they've had in having 7 players now suspended over the last 3 years for an array of different drug problems. They are in a league that is legislated for parity. They have an opportunity to be a big giant. I mean, you talk about what we saw on Monday. The New Orleans Saints have been one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the NFL all year. They won a Super Bowl 4 years ago. They come here and they lose 34-7. I mean, that's just unheard of in the NFL for a team to be that dominant over another. So if the Seahawks finish this job, they could realistically, Danny, go down as one of the greatest teams ever, believe it or not.
One of the things that's most interesting about this team is the NFL, of all the leagues I've covered, and I'd be interested to hear because I've never covered college football on a daily basis like Bob did, but of all the pro leagues, NBA, Major League Baseball, the NFL is by far the most structured. The coaches, in large part, run variations of the same plays. The players often say much of the same things in the cliches that we hear. And Seattle, from the very beginning under Pete Carroll, has been different. Now, the cliches are still there. If you've heard Russell Wilson talk, he still does some of that. But in terms of Pete Carroll, from the moment he was hired, embraced this idea that I was fired twice in the NFL before. I went back to college. I redefined the way I was coaching. I redefined the way I communicated with my players. And I'm coming back improved and ready to achieve success like I never had before. And we're now kind of seeing that. And for me, kind of the observation of it, it's just so intriguing from management, from the sort of the personal philosophy side of it, from the strategic element of how they've built the team. All these different things come together. Seattle is doing this differently. They have the shortest quarterback in the NFL. They have 2 cornerbacks who are taller than pretty much everyone else. They have been able to find value at places that people couldn't, and they've been able to turn this around way faster. I mean, the Mariners are going to be an unfortunate parallel, and in fact, divergence. Now, it's not fair to go apples to apples because it takes longer to turn around a baseball franchise, but what you've seen with the Seahawks is really nothing short of extraordinary. They were 4-12 and then 5-11 before Pete Carroll arrived. They've made the playoffs now for the third time in 4 years. And it's really, for me, it's just so fun to watch. And Bob, for your first year covering the team, how has it been different? Because the NFL is so structured. Pete Carroll talks at 3 o'clock on Mondays, and then he talks about 12:30, 12:40 on Wednesdays. Then he talks after practice. Like, it's very structured. What have been your impressions of this team?
Yeah, well, college sports is becoming much more that way, which is, to me, is really unfortunate, because college football, I think, wants to become like the NFL a little bit. There's no doubt at all. The NFL is way, way, way up here right now in the pecking order of sports compared to everything. And college football, you even see the Alabama-Auburn game, and you see the ratings, and they don't compare at all to even what's kind of your lowest level game on a Sunday. And I think college football is making a mistake by trying to kind of copy the NFL model. And if you've gone to games at Husky Stadium or other places, you see, the band maybe isn't quite the focal point of things as it used to be. And I think college football should kind of stick with the tradition of what it was. But we're seeing that as well in terms of the access and things like that too. And in terms of the money being paid to coaches, I mean, you see Steve Sarkisian is going to make about probably $4 million or so at USC. He was making about $2.5 million at the University of Washington. UW's now probably going to have to pay upward $3 million or more for a coach there. College football is really just it's always been referred to as kind of the minor leagues of the NFL, but more and more it's becoming the high class AAA of the NFL these days.
Yeah. Now let's talk about kind of how we go about doing things. Our jobs are all very different, and for me, I'll start off. I'm a sports columnist. My job is to give my opinion, and I'm a general sports columnist. We have certain writers at the Seattle Times. Excuse me. I don't know why I said that. That is not a Freudian slip.
It could be a slip.
Like that.
You're gonna have to have a conversation with Jerry after this.
No, we have certain writers like a Bud Withers, who is a columnist on college sports. Larry Stone, before he became a general sports columnist, he was a columnist on baseball. At times, you were a columnist on the NFL, and now you've taken over that role on Sundays as well. My job is to look at things from a broader perspective. I'm not the guy who's going to really dissect why the Seahawks run defense is good. I am the guy who's more going to say, is Pete Carroll living up to the right standard? Is this team's are the drug suspensions a big deal or not? In the big picture of things, how good are the Seahawks versus the rest of the NFL? So as I go into the locker room and spend my time, my approach is a lot different. Bob has to get any and everything, every little bit of news. I'm not searching for the news as much, so I spend a lot of time where I can do more big picture stuff. Danny is fantastic about going in the locker room and being able to have a casual conversation with any player there. I'm not around enough to establish the deep relationships, because there's always a Mariner something or a Husky something or a Sounder something that I need to do. But I'm more likely to be the kind of person who wants to take a guy off to the side and have a big picture discussion about the guy. That's kind of how I fill my role. How about you, Danny, now?
Well, I covered the NBA for 3 years before I moved on to covering the Seahawks. And the NFL is much more difficult to cover in terms of getting to know the players. In the NBA, there's 12 guys on the roster, sometimes 13 or 14, depending on injured players. But you're around them for 82 games, and you're with them on the road, and you're with them 45 minutes before the game, and you're with them after the game, and you really get a sense of knowing the players. I felt like every person I wrote about, I knew their personality and kind of how it all fit together. Didn't know everything about them, but you had a good sense of who they were. That was really hard for me in the NFL, and it wasn't really until my third or fourth year that I began to understand, because it is so structured. Some of it is the nature of the contracts. In NFL, their contracts aren't guaranteed, which means any player that you talk to, most likely their income, their salary for the next year, while they have a contract, they're not guaranteed to earn that if the team decides to cut them. So they're much more hesitant to speak their mind. I remember Ray Allen criticizing the Sonics for not having a team plane, that they only flew charters after the game. And this created a problem when the planes were delayed and they needed to have their own plane. There's no NFL player ever that would do that. Like, you're not going to criticize the hand that feeds you at any point, and the coaches have so much control in the NFL. But what I've found is that NFL players are it is, in my mind, the most interesting workforce to cover. If you look at it from an employment perspective, these are guys in their 20s. Their business is their bodies. they're going to earn almost all of their money in their 20s, which is the time when most of us are least well equipped to make smart decisions with how you deal with that. You factor in the fame of that and just the perspective that it comes with understanding you're disposable. Like at the age of 24, every one of those guys knows that they're going to hold that job only until the team finds someone who is either cheaper or better at the job than they are. And so it creates this, they're fantastically irreverent. And I've really enjoyed the connections I've made. And once it kind of occurred to me, like how you communicate with some of the players, it's been, and it is, as a beat reporter, you're in there to try and learn as much as you can. And I found in the time that I was there, the one thing that was best at the Seattle Times was they gave you the freedom to write about some of the interesting things that you'd find. I wrote a story one time about what happens at the bottom of a pile. So there's a loose football and everybody goes around and you talk to, and that was my, like, that's kind of like all this instant replay and everything that we see everything. Nobody has any idea what goes on in there because it's horrible. Like it's the kind of thing that we probably shouldn't talk about over lunch. And those sort of things that when you hear it, when you hear those sort of things, I remember, and it was Will Herring said that he didn't know what somebody did to the guy, but he felt the guy let go, so somebody must have been doing something horrible to him. And that was the explanation for it. You don't look at it anymore. You can't really see. He also described getting fish hooked, where a player had reached into his mask, and he goes, and I don't know if I was just like my raised, because he was raised down south. He went to Auburn. He's like, and I just kind of shook it out, and I spit the hook out. So somebody had his fingers in his mouth and was pulling on it. It's a really incredible, it sounds gross. I probably shouldn't have told that story. But it's it's an incredible job experience to be talking to people about. And then when you combine with how interested people are with it, I've really, the people is by far the best part of the job.
Well, yeah, I dovetail on what Danny said. You know, the players, many of the players there for the NFL, to them that means not for long, because many of the players understand that they can get cut tomorrow. I mean, they are. You see a guy like Steven Williams, who was the star of the Seahawks preseason, and gets cut, and he signs with Jacksonville, gets hurt there. He has no idea what it is. So he kind of goes from August to I'm the star of the preseason for a team that might win the Super Bowl, so to today it's December 4th or whatever. He has no idea if he's ever going to play an NFL game again. There was a fascinating, actually, if you ever follow any of the players on Twitter or anything too, but when the Seahawks brought Bruce Irvin, their linebacker, back off his 4-game suspension, and coaches talked glowingly about, one of the coaches, the linebacker coach Ken Norton, talked about it's like having a new toy to play with. Malcolm Smith, who was the player who was starting at Bruce Irvin's position, responded on Twitter after seeing Ken Norton say that, said, "Now I know how Woody felt in Toy Story." But it was a funny line, but it was also a really fascinating glimpse into, he's like, okay, I guess I lost my job now, which he sort of has. And so it's like, you know, you sort of, and to me, that's what's really fascinating about this aspect of it. You know, you kind of see the play, you know, you kind of look at the wins and losses, but you also look in there, and each guy really has his own place he is on this. And, you know, you got the Richard Shermans and Russell Wilsons who have a really secure spot. You got a lot of guys at the bottom of that roster who, it's a very tenuous situation every single day, and I really find that fascinating.
One of the most interesting things about Seattle's locker room in particular, now that we're seeing this success, is that in the locker room you try to maintain the same approach that these players have had, even as the attention increases, even as the stakes rise. And that idea of trying to insulate, and it is like a bubble at times, where they're trying to insulate themselves. Some of them are on Twitter, but they have horrible things said about the way they play on Twitter. And if it goes bad, it can go bad very quickly. And that attempt to kind of maintain this even keel in the midst of all this scrutiny and excitement and everything else that's happening, it's sort of this fantastic dichotomy.
Wow, I mean, time flies. I really want to lock the doors and make us have to stay in here extra long, but we want to do answer some questions. No one has any use for dessert after Danny's story about what happens at the bottom of the pile, so feel free to ask us anything under the sun. Start here.
Back in the day, Deion Sanders was the best cover corner in the league, couldn't tackle anybody. Is that Richard Sherman? Is he the best cover corner, but he doesn't seem to be able to tackle people? Comment.
He's a much better tackler than Deion Sanders ever was. Some of these one-armed flailing things that Deion used to do. It's very interesting. When the Seahawks got Richard Sherman, he was a wide receiver who converted to cornerback while he was at Stanford because he felt like he had more pro potential there. When he got there, he's this lanky guy that the Seahawks felt like they needed to toughen up. That was one area. They wanted him to get better at run support. And I honestly think that for a corner, he's very good, but he's got a very specific skill set and a very specific role that Pete Carroll has carved out for him in that defense. And it is, you are a number one cover guy, and that's his specialty. But I wouldn't underrate. I mean, there's been some games where he's come up and made some physical tackles, some plays that impressed me beyond, because he's just this. I mean, he's more hair than anything else. Just this really small guy. But I'm impressed with his ability to step up and tackle people.
Jerry, I appreciated your column this morning. Very optimistic column with the headline, "The UW can do way better than Sark this time around." Elaborate on that. I thought the script was Mora would start crawling to Seattle, but I guess not.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think, what's interesting in life is something that was your dream job. Your dream job really evolves, and I don't think Mora wanted to come back here and risk the possibility of failing. He had already failed in his hometown. Seahawks fans are very vicious. He didn't like the way they reacted. He didn't think that he got enough time to turn the program around, number one. But he didn't like that whole idea of, I'm back in my hometown and people are criticizing me at this level. Husky football is his heart. I mean, I truly do think it is that way. But I think that he had trouble kind of rationalizing, I've already got something good going at UCLA. I'm 2 years into this thing. Do I want to come home and risk, I think he would have done very well here, but what if he had done the job Tyrone Willingham did? And then all of a sudden, all of your great feelings about your university now become bittersweet. I do, and I'll kind of hand this off to both of you, I think that Sark did a good job. If I had to grade him, I probably would give him a B-. When they hired him, they hired an offensive coordinator who had never been a head coach before. And for all the great things he did as a young coach, his recruiting, his development, his camaraderie with the players, he left a lot to be desired on the tactician side. And that is, when you take a job at 34 years old, it is going to be a process. There's going to be some on-the-job training. That's what they needed to do in order to get the best possible candidate when they had 0 wins. Now they're in a much better position, and I think there's an opportunity, if they're aggressive about getting the right people, if they don't settle, where they can get a coach who doesn't require any on-the-job training. And I think that is goal number one for the Huskies.
Yeah, I think Jerry's column this morning in the Seattle Times was fantastic in pointing out when you hired a coach last time, they were 0-12. They had an athletic director who was essentially making his first prominent hire, and you had a stadium that needed to be rehabilitated. You now have a program that's on its uptick. It's won 8 games for only the 4th time in the past 20 years, and you've got a new refurbished stadium. The one thing I'll say about Sark is I guess I'm a little harsh. I think Sark was a great sort of emergency responder. He came, performed CPR, revitalized the program. He got it back to having a heartbeat, and because it was flatlined. It was 0-12 when he got it. I don't know if he was the best long-term care physician for the University of Washington. I'm excited about the opportunity that they're going to have, and Jim Mora is someone that, having covered him first when he was an assistant coach at UW, and then with the Seahawks, I think I know him about as well as any coach that I've ever covered, and I think that Jim, over the past 4 or 5 years, has really been tugged at over what people wanted him to do as opposed to what he wanted to do in terms of becoming the successor to Mike Holmgren in a way that I think Jim would have probably preferred it not happen that way, that when you get hired, you're able to show up at the press conference where you're introduced. And with the University of Washington, when that job came open and he was signed to do the Seahawks, become the Seahawks head coach, and so many people wanted him, that there becomes an element of, I think if he was going to come to University of Washington, he had to know it was going to be the last coaching job he would ever want. And I don't think he knows that right now. He's 2 years in at UCLA, and is he going to break his commitment to all the kids he's recruited to rebuild there? And is that really, because if he comes here, it's probably going to preclude a chance at going back to the NFL. I don't know if he'd ever be able to leave here, and I don't know if he's ready to say that.
Hey, Bob, you covered Sark. Can you be honest about this whole? Sark was not the golden boy that he kind of perceived himself to be, was he? He gave you a hard time like that. That's one of the reasons you're covering the Seahawks now. It's because you were a little tired of Sark. Yes, you were tired of Sark. Yes, you were.
No, I didn't have any real. Sark is very emotional, and he really took. He did not. He was one of those coaches. A lot of times, I mean, I guess we see this with Pete Carroll, and so far with Pete anyway. Every week he sort of acts the same. Sark did not. So if they were playing Idaho State or somebody, he was the best guy in the world to be around. If they were playing Nebraska, I remember that Nebraska week in 2010, the game where they ended up getting hammered 56-21. He was the tightest guy, and you couldn't ask him anything. He was mad all week about everything. We'd try to ask this or that, and he'd be short with his answers. And I would, where Danny talked about the kind of being the long-term physician guy, that's where I wondered if he was going to be able to ever get to that 10 or 11 type of stage where you've got to, as a football coach, you do have to sort of live by all these every game is the same kind of cliches, and especially when you're dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, you've really got to get them to play at this consistent level all the time, and they need to see that from their leader, and they need to not see that their leader thinks this game is bigger than that game, and even if you're not saying that, but if they're reading your cues. So it'll be very interesting to see how he handles it at USC, where every single game is the Super Bowl. I mean, when you're at USC, you got to win them all. You got to be entertaining. You've got to be entertaining yourself. There's a reason why, other than Pete Carroll, nobody's lasted as a coach there very long.
Okay, next question.
So, given what you've had to say about Coach Carroll, I'm curious how, the success has been phenomenal, and I'm curious how you would characterize his leadership style with the team.
Yeah, that's a great question. Pete is very consistent in his message. His message is very simple. Sometimes it's so simple you almost feel like you're reading a children's book. But that's kind of, he really is an expert communicator in saying, people can only grasp this. And so he's very careful in his language with the players to make sure that he bears it down to the essence of what he's trying to say. And then he just hammers. He's got all kinds of little things that it's all about the ball. He tells the team, that's what he said from day one. It's all about the ball. They're the best team in the NFL in protecting the football and taking the ball away from opponents. What are his three? He's got his three tenets where he says, always protect the team, be early, and what else? No whining, no complaining. He in a sense, he's kind of a disciple of John Wooden because he studied John Wooden very closely, and he kind of took some of the things that of John Wooden's pyramid of success, tweaked it so it fits his own way. Pete very much believes that he's not just building a football team, he's building a way where people can be successful in any aspect of life. And that's very interesting because most of us would say, well, you just go get the biggest, baddest athletes on the planet, you're going to win football games. But as you've seen what he's done in the NFL, where you can't go out and just take five-star player after five-star player, you have to win within the system. I think it's given a lot of credibility to his way of doing things. He has this odd way of doing it, but he's one of the most charismatic leaders I've seen in quite a while.
My co-host, Brock Heward, said this, that Pete Carroll, unlike Brock's father, is not a bare-butt spanker. Like, he's not the guy that kind of motivates through fear. And I think that is actually one of the heart of it, that he believes in the way, if you believe the best in your employees, if you believe the best in the people that are playing for you, that it's going to serve you best, they're going to play harder for you than if they're playing to protect their job. The second thing I would say that comes out in him is a belief in young people's potential. And I think it comes out in a number of different ways, not just some of the foundation work that he does, but also just the young players. He plays more young players. He coached for a guy named Bud Grant in Minnesota who said, you lose one game for every rookie you play. Pete's become kind of the antithesis of that in believing that let's get these guys ready and give them something small they can do and get them involved. You don't just put them on the shelf. The last thing, it was before he'd even coached a game. I went and saw him speak at a Puget Sound Business Journal. It was a breakfast meeting. And so it was about the same size, maybe a little bit smaller than this room. And he said that you have to have a philosophy that you can express in 25 words. And if you can't express that philosophy in 25 words, how are you going to expect your employees to understand what you want for them? And I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Can I express my philosophy for what I want to do? I don't have any employees. It's just me. And I wasn't sure. And then he said, he said, our philosophy is we're going to do things better than they've ever been done before. And I was like, that's not a philosophy. That's like some sort of greeting card. But there is an element of that, of if you follow what he says, I don't think you can help but be a better person. Now, I don't know how deep it is, and there's some self-motivational things that are in there, but really his approach to things, and it is so different from the NFL, because the NFL is about tight, it's about coaches fearing that the players are going to screw up their plays. Like, that's when it gets down to it, and Pete does come from a very different way.
All right, we have time
We
for
have
one
time
more.
for one more
All right.
question.
No, I guess we do not. Sorry. We're all out of time.
Well, we'll take it off the stage then.
Great.
So,
thank you very much.
much.
Join me in thanking our reporters.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.